When I first prepared this story for Diary of Owen, the detail I kept returning to was not the phone call itself. It was the folded funeral program left on an empty chair, slowly opening each time the heating vent came on beneath it. By the time the final hymn began, the chair had been empty for 43 minutes. Welcome to Diary of Owen. Let's go back to that morning. The light inside the chapel was the pale gray of an old photograph. It came through 6 narrow windows along the eastern wall and settled across the wooden pews in clean, rectangular sections. Dust moved inside those sections whenever someone passed, rising briefly and then disappearing. At 9:17 that morning, I stood beside my father's closed casket and watched one of those rectangles reach the polished toe of my left shoe. My shoes were new. That bothered me more than it should have. My father had spent most of his life wearing the same pair of brown work boots until the soles became smooth enough to slide on wet pavement. He believed new shoes made a man walk too carefully. Yet there I was at his funeral in black leather shoes I had purchased 2 nights earlier from a store beside the municipal library, standing with my feet positioned as if the floor might crack beneath me. The chapel belonged to St. Aldwyn's Memorial House, a low brick building on Briar Mill Road in the fictional town of Westmere. The carpet was dark green, the walls were cream. Someone had placed 2 arrangements of white lilies near the casket, though my father had never liked lilies. He said they looked too aware of their own importance. I had requested simple branches of winterberry. The funeral director, Mr. Tolland, explained that winterberry was difficult to source in February and offered lilies instead. I agreed because during the 72 hours after someone dies, people repeatedly ask you to make decisions about things that have already become meaningless. Casket wood, program paper, coffee strength, the number of chairs, whether the body should wear a wristwatch. My father's watch was in my inside coat pocket. It had stopped at 4:12 on Tuesday morning, though he had died at 3:46. The watch had always run 26 minutes slow because he preferred to correct for it mentally rather than pay someone to repair it. I was 40 years old when he died. My father, Everett Hale, was 68. 3 weeks earlier, he had stood in my kitchen cutting an apple into 8 identical sections while telling me the ache beneath his shoulder blade was probably from lifting bags of soil. He had built raised beds behind his house even though the ground was frozen. At 3:18 on the morning he died, he called me. By 3:31, I was driving through sleet. By 3:44, the ambulance was outside his house. By the time I reached the second-floor bedroom, a paramedic was counting compressions aloud. I remember the count reaching 27, then 30, then beginning again. My father had been wearing a blue thermal shirt and 1 gray sock. His other sock was on the floor beside the bed. For the next 4 days, I kept thinking about that sock. Grief often chooses an object because the whole truth is too large to carry. My fiancée, Maren Vale, arrived at the chapel at 9:23. She was 6 minutes late. I noticed because noticing time was part of how I made sense of disorder. I worked as a rail operations planner for Northmere Transit Authority, coordinating freight movements across a network of switching yards, service corridors, and single-track bottlenecks. My job was built around sequences. A train entering Junction 4 at the wrong minute could delay 12 others by evening. One small failure, unattended, rarely remained small. I knew delays were not always negligence. Weather happened, signals failed, people became ill. The important question was whether the system acknowledged the interruption and adjusted honestly. Maren entered through the chapel's side door, wearing a charcoal coat over a black dress. Her dark hair was pulled into a low knot. She carried a paper cup in one hand and her phone in the other. She came directly to me and placed her palm against my back. She said the parking lot was fuller than she expected. I said it was all right. She asked whether I had eaten. I said no. She told me she had brought a banana in her handbag. I thanked her. Her hand remained on my back for perhaps 3 seconds. Then her phone vibrated. She glanced down, silenced it, and slipped it into her coat pocket. That was the first call. At the time, it seemed unimportant. Maren and I had been together for 6 years and engaged for 11 months. We lived in a narrow brick townhouse on Larkspur Row, 8 miles from the chapel. We had chosen it because the upstairs room faced north and received stable light, which Maren needed for her work. She designed exhibition spaces for museums and private galleries, not the artwork itself, but the rooms around it. She decided where visitors slowed down, what they saw first, how close they could stand, and which walls remained empty so the important objects had space to breathe. When we first met, I liked the way she described emptiness as an active choice. She said a blank wall could direct attention more powerfully than a crowded one. I had been 34 then, newly promoted and quietly convinced that my life had settled into a permanent shape. Work during the week, dinner with my father every second Thursday, running beside the canal on Saturday mornings, one drink at the Fox and Lantern with the same 3 colleagues once a month. Then Maren came into the control office to discuss a temporary public art installation at Westmere Central Station. She stood beneath the departure board with a rolled blueprint under one arm and asked why the eastern concourse narrowed by nearly 2 meters near Platform 6. I told her the wall concealed an electrical cabinet installed in 1989. She said the wall made the whole station feel as if it were holding its breath. I remember looking at her for a moment longer than was professionally necessary. 3 weeks later, I took her to dinner. 6 months after that, she met my father. He approved of her almost immediately, though he tried not to show it. My father had spent 37 years repairing agricultural machinery. He trusted people who understood that function and appearance were not enemies. Maren asked intelligent questions about his workshop. She noticed the pegboard where he outlined each tool in black marker so he would know when something was missing. She admired a wooden cabinet he had built from ash. She listened when he explained why older tractor engines were easier to maintain than newer ones. After she left, he said she knew how to look at things. From my father, that was high praise. When I proposed, I used his mother's ring. Maren and I had discussed marriage in practical terms before then. Neither of us believed surprise was necessary for sincerity. We spoke about money, children, work, property, and what would happen if one of us needed to care for an aging parent. At the time, my father was healthy enough to climb onto his workshop roof and replace a sheet of corrugated metal by himself. Maren said he would probably outlive us both. My father said she should not count on inheriting his tools because he intended to be buried with the good ones. Our wedding was scheduled for September 19th at an old conservatory outside Bellwether. By the morning of his funeral, deposits had been paid, invitations printed, and a spreadsheet on our shared laptop contained the dietary requirements of 87 guests. The wedding felt both close and impossibly distant as I stood in that chapel. Maren took the seat beside mine in the front row. On her other side sat my Aunt Sylvie, my father's younger sister. Sylvie wore a dark blue suit and kept a folded handkerchief clutched in her fist. Her knuckles had gone white. At 9:41, the chapel doors closed. At 9:44, Mr. Tallon stepped to the lectern. At 9:46, the service began. The first reading was from a notebook my father kept in his workshop. It was not a diary. He recorded oil measurements, parts numbers, weather conditions, and reminders to himself. On one page, beneath a list of replacement belts for a threshing machine, he had written that useful work was mostly the decision to stay until the difficult part was finished. My aunt read that line. Her voice broke on the word stay. Maren's phone vibrated again. The sound was muted, but I felt the movement through the wooden bench because her coat was touching mine. She removed the phone and looked at the screen. Her expression changed in a way most people would not have noticed. Her eyebrows did not lift. Her mouth did not open. She simply became more attentive to the device than to the room around her. She pressed the side button and returned the phone to her lap. The second call. Our relationship had not been unhappy. That is important. Unhappiness would have given me an explanation simple enough to resent. Instead, Maren and I had built a life that worked well on most days. We divided household tasks without keeping score. She cooked more often, I cleaned more thoroughly. She chose our furniture. I managed the accounts. She disliked driving at night, so I drove. I disliked social events where I knew no one, so she stayed near me until I found a conversation I could enter. When I woke at 2 a.m., because a winter storm threatened the northern freight line, she made coffee without being asked. When she spent 14-hour days preparing an exhibition opening, I brought dinner to the gallery and waited quietly while she adjusted lights by fractions of an inch. Love, for us, had not been dramatic. It had been a sequence of small accommodations performed so consistently that they began to feel structural. My father liked that about us. He said we fit without making a performance of fitting. But during the final year of our relationship, another name had begun appearing in the margins: Dorian Pike. Dorian was the development director at a private cultural foundation called the Leiden Forum. He was 43, divorced, articulate, and skilled at making every project sound urgent enough to justify neglecting everything outside it. Maren had first worked with him on an exhibition titled After the Flood, which involved suspended glass panels, archived letters, and a sound installation that played recordings of water moving through damaged buildings. The project lasted 5 months. Dorian called often. At first, the calls were practical: lighting approvals, donor requests, installation problems, insurance questions. They arrived at inconvenient times because cultural work, like rail work, did not always respect office hours. I understood that. Then the calls became less defined. He called after successful meetings to discuss how successful they had been. He called when a trustee annoyed him. He called because he had seen a building in another city and wanted Maren's opinion on the entrance. He called from airports, restaurants, hotel lobbies, and once from a taxi at 1:12 in the morning. Maren always had a reason to answer. He was under pressure, the funding was unstable, the board was difficult. She was the only person who understood the full project. I did not accuse her of anything because, at first, there was nothing clear enough to accuse. I asked whether Dorian understood that she had a life outside work. She said he did, but he was going through a complicated period. I asked whether complicated periods required midnight phone calls. She said sometimes they did. That answer stayed with me. At work, we had a rule for emergency communications. If everything was called urgent, nothing could be routed properly. A dispatcher who treated minor delays as crises eventually lost the attention of everyone needed for a real crisis. Dorian's emergencies had no hierarchy. A donor withdrawing $50,000 and a disappointing dinner reservation seemed to reach Maren with equal priority. I told myself that the project would end. It did. The calls did not. At 9:58 on the morning of my father's funeral, Mr. Tolland invited me to speak. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and walked to the lectern. My notes were folded once in my pocket. I had written them at 4:30 that morning because sleep had become impossible. The chapel held 62 people, former customers, neighbors, 2 men from the machinery yard where my father had worked, the nurse who checked his blood pressure every 6 months. My colleagues Lena Marr and Tobias Grell sat in the 4th row. Behind them was Cal Mercer, my father's closest friend, who had known him since they were 14. I placed both hands on the sides of the lectern. The wood felt warm from my aunt's palms. I began by saying my father distrusted speeches because he believed they made ordinary decency sound unusual. A few people smiled. I told them about his habit of carrying spare gloves in his truck for people who arrived unprepared. I described the shelves in his garage labeled with dates rather than contents because he remembered when he had stored something more reliably than what it was. I spoke about the first bicycle he repaired for me. I was 9. The chain slipped every time I stood on the pedals. He could have fixed it alone in 10 minutes, but he made me hold the rear wheel, inspect the teeth, and understand why the chain had become loose. He told me repair was not the same as making something appear functional. Repair meant finding the point where the strain began. As I said those words, Maren's phone vibrated for the 3rd time. She looked down. This time, she did not silence it immediately. The screen illuminated her face. I could not see the name from the lectern, but I saw her close her eyes briefly. Then she stood. She bent toward my aunt and whispered something. My aunt looked confused and shifted her knees to let Maren pass. Maren walked along the front pew, opened the side door, and left the chapel. The door closed softly behind her. I paused. Only for a second. I could hear the heating system pushing air through the vent beneath her chair. The funeral program she had left on the seat lifted at one corner and fell back. I returned to my notes. I finished the story about the bicycle. I spoke for another 7 minutes. When I stepped away from the lectern, my aunt squeezed my wrist. She did not ask where Marin had gone. Neither did I. During the next reading, I looked through the narrow glass panel in the side door. Marin stood beneath the chapel awning, with her back partially turned to the building. She held the phone to her ear. Her free hand moved as she spoke, drawing small shapes in the cold air. The rain had begun again. Fine drops gathered along the shoulders of her coat. She did not appear frightened. She did not appear to be receiving news of illness, injury, or death. She appeared concentrated, engaged, necessary. I watched for perhaps 4 seconds. Then the person behind me coughed, and I faced forward again. The service continued. At 10:17, Cal Mercer spoke about the summer he and my father rebuilt a grain elevator after a lightning strike. At 10:24, a recording of a cello arrangement began. At 10:31, the final prayer was read. Marin did not return. At 10:34, 6 men lifted my father's casket. I was one of them. The handle was colder than I expected. We carried him through the central aisle while people stood. My eyes remained on the open doors ahead. Outside, the hearse waited beside the curb, with rain darkening its roof. As we reached the entrance, I saw Marin across the parking lot, near a bare maple tree. She was still on the phone. She had moved away from the awning, perhaps because she did not want her voice to carry into the chapel. One hand held her coat closed at the throat. Her head was lowered. She looked toward us as the casket emerged. For one moment, our eyes met across 25 meters of wet asphalt. She lifted one finger, the gesture people use to ask for another minute. Then she turned slightly away and continued listening. I helped guide my father into the hearse. The rear door closed. Rain collected on my eyelashes. My aunt stood beside me, trembling. I opened the umbrella over her. Cal placed his hand on my shoulder. At 10:39, the hearse left for Hallowmere Cemetery. Marin remained in the parking lot. The burial took place on a low hill bordered by cedar trees. There were 19 chairs beneath a canvas shelter, though most people stood. The rain struck the canvas in irregular bursts, a sound like handfuls of dry grain being thrown against a roof. My father's grave was beside my mother's. She had died when I was 26. After 7 months of treatment for a cancer discovered too late. My father had visited the cemetery every Sunday after that, even when snow covered the path. He never brought flowers. He brought a thermos of coffee and sat on the bench opposite her headstone. He said flowers were for people passing through. Coffee meant you intended to stay. At the graveside, I stood between my aunt and an empty space where Marin should have been. I checked my phone once. There were no messages from her. At 10:52, the minister began. At 11:03, my father's casket was lowered. At 11:07, the rain stopped. The sudden quiet was so complete that I heard water dripping from the cedar branches onto the plastic roof of the lowering mechanism. Aunt Sylvie took my arm. She said she was sorry. I knew she did not mean only my father. I said we would talk later. After the burial, the mourners returned to St. Aldwyn's for coffee, sandwiches, and a tray of small lemon cakes someone from my father's street had made. I did not go back immediately. I stayed at the grave until the workers approached with their equipment. One of them, a broad man named Ellis, asked whether I needed another minute. I said no. Then I said yes. He nodded and walked away. I stood there for 5 more minutes. The ground around the grave was covered with green fabric to conceal the mud. One corner had folded back, revealing tire tracks beneath it. I took my father's watch from my pocket. The hand still showed 4:12. I wound it carefully. It began ticking. I held it near my ear. Then I returned it to my pocket and walked to my car. Marin arrived at St. Aldwyn's at 11:36. I know because I was standing near the coffee table when she came through the reception room doors. Her coat was wet from the shoulders down. A strand of hair had loosened near her cheek. She looked around the room until she found me. She approached quickly. She said she was sorry and asked whether we could speak somewhere private. I looked at the people around us. My aunt was seated with Cal. 2 of my colleagues were helping carry plates. Mr. Tolland was explaining to an elderly neighbor where the restroom was. I said not yet. Marin touched my forearm. She said the call had been complicated. I said I understood that she took it. My voice was calm enough that she seemed briefly relieved. She asked how the burial had been. I looked at her. That question made something inside me settle. Not break. Settle. In rail planning, there is a point during a major disruption when restoring the original schedule becomes impossible. The network has moved too far from its intended sequence. Continuing to pretend otherwise only creates more damage. You stop trying to recover the old plan. You establish a new one from the train's actual positions. Until that moment, I had been trying to preserve the planned route of our relationship. I had treated every late call, every interrupted dinner, every unexplained urgency as a temporary obstruction. Standing beside the coffee table at my father's funeral, I understood our actual positions. I said the burial was finished. She lowered her eyes. She told me Dorian had called because he was having a serious personal crisis. I asked whether he was injured. She said no. I asked whether someone had died. She said no. I asked whether he was in immediate danger. She hesitated. Then she said not exactly. I waited. She explained that Dorian's former wife had become engaged. He had found out that morning through a photograph posted by a mutual friend. He had been drinking since early morning and called Marin because he felt he had no one else. The room around us remained softly busy. Cups touched saucers. A chair scraped across the floor. Someone laughed at a story about my father and then apologized for laughing, though no apology was needed. I asked Marin how long the call lasted. She said she had not checked. I said it lasted at least an hour and 22 minutes. She looked at me. She said she had tried to end it, but Dorian kept saying he could not be alone. I asked whether he was alone now. She said his brother was driving to him. I nodded. Marin said she knew the timing was terrible, but she had been afraid of what Dorian might do if she disconnected. I asked whether he had threatened to harm himself. She said not directly. I asked what he had said. She told me he said there was no point in anything anymore. I understood why she had taken that seriously. I did not accuse her of inventing urgency. I did not tell her she should have ignored someone who sounded unstable. I did not ask her to choose between compassion and loyalty, as if those things could never coexist. I asked one question. Why had she not told anyone where she was going before leaving? She looked toward the windows. She said she thought she would be gone for 2 minutes. I said she was gone through my father's burial. She told me she had lost track of time. I nodded again. That was the entire conversation. Aunt Sylvie approached before either of us said more. She asked whether I could help her find the container holding my father's military papers. Marin offered to help, but my aunt said she needed me. I followed her into the office. The papers were inside a gray document box on a shelf. Sylvie closed the door behind us. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she asked whether I wanted her to send Marin home. I said no. She asked whether I wanted to leave. I said I could not leave my father's reception. My aunt looked at me with the same expression my father used when he knew I was avoiding the real answer. She said, "Everett loved her, but he would not want you to confuse understanding someone with abandoning yourself." I looked down at the document box. The lid had been labeled in my father's handwriting. Service records, house deed, things Owen will need. The letters were blocky and slightly tilted. I ran my thumb over my name. I said I did not know what I was going to do. Sylvie replied that I did not have to know that afternoon. She was right, but some decisions begin before we consciously make them. For the rest of the reception, I performed the duties expected of me. I thanked people for coming. I accepted condolences. I listened to stories about my father I had never heard. One man told me my father had repaired his combine for free after a barn fire. A woman from the edge of town said he had cleared her driveway every winter for 11 years and refused payment. At 12:48, the last guests began leaving. Marin remained near the coat rack. She had tried to approach me twice, but each time someone interrupted. I did not avoid her. I simply did not make room. At 1:06, Mr. Toland handed me the remaining funeral programs, the condolence book, and my father's framed photograph. Marin reached for the photograph. I let her carry it. We walked to the parking lot together. The rain had stopped, but water ran along the curb in a thin brown stream. My car was parked in the second row. Hers was near the side entrance. She asked whether I wanted her to come home with me. I said I was going to my father's house. She said she would come there. I told her I needed to be alone. She folded her arms across her coat. She asked whether I was angry. I said I was grieving. She said she knew, and she wanted to support me. I looked at the photograph she was holding. My father stood beside his workshop in it, one hand resting on the open hood of an old tractor. His expression was almost a smile. I took the frame from her. I said I would call when I was ready to talk. She asked whether that meant tonight. I said I did not know. She nodded, but her face tightened. Then she said she wished I would say what I was thinking instead of shutting her out. I almost answered immediately. Instead, I waited until the urge passed. I said I was thinking that my father had been carried out of a chapel while she stood in the rain, asking another man not to feel alone. She closed her eyes. I opened my car door. She said Dorian needed someone. I said so did I. Then I left. My father's house was 12 minutes from the chapel. I drove there without turning on the radio. Water hissed beneath the tires. The sky had lowered until the rooftops seemed to touch it. His driveway still held the tracks left by the ambulance. Inside, the house was exactly as we had left it on Tuesday morning. A mug beside the sink, one kitchen chair angled away from the table, a newspaper folded to the weather page, his boots beneath the radiator. I placed the framed photograph on the counter and removed my coat. The silence in the house was different from ordinary silence. It did not feel empty. It felt interrupted, as if every object expected my father to return and complete whatever he had been doing. A bowl on the table contained 5 apples. One had a bruise near the stem. I picked it up and found his paring knife in the second drawer. I cut the apple into 8 sections. They were not equal. I sat at the table until darkness filled the kitchen windows. At 4:22, Maren sent a message asking whether I was safe. I replied that I was. At 4:47, she asked whether she should bring food. I said no. At 6:03, she wrote that she loved me and was deeply sorry. I read the message twice. Then I turned my phone face down. That night, I slept in my childhood bedroom beneath a faded quilt my mother had made. The room contained a narrow desk, a shelf of school trophies, and a crack in the ceiling shaped like a river delta. At 2:16 in the morning, I woke because I thought I heard my father moving in the hallway. For several seconds, I believed he was alive. The mind is merciful in small, temporary ways. Then I remembered. I lay still until morning. Over the next 9 days, I dealt with the practical aftermath of death. I closed accounts, canceled appointments, collected documents, called a company to retrieve rented oxygen equipment that my father had used only once after a winter infection. I washed the mug beside the sink. I folded his shirts. I found 23 euros and 40 cents in coins inside a tobacco tin, though he had never smoked. Maren came to the house twice. The first time, she brought soup and bread. She stayed for 40 minutes and helped sort sympathy cards. We spoke politely. The second time, she asked whether we could discuss the funeral. We sat in my father's workshop at 5:30 on a Sunday afternoon. The room smelled of cold metal and sawdust. His tools remained outlined on the pegboard. A portable heater clicked beside the workbench. Maren wore the red scarf my father had given her the previous Christmas. She began by saying she had replayed the day repeatedly. She said she knew leaving had hurt me. She admitted she should have returned sooner. She said she had become trapped by the possibility that ending the call might cause something irreversible. I listened. She told me Dorian had since apologized for contacting her during the funeral. I asked how he knew where she was. She said he knew my father had died. I asked how. She said she had told him. I asked whether she had spoken to him before the service. She said he had sent messages the previous evening. I looked toward the pegboard. One wrench was missing from its outline. I later found it beneath the workbench. I asked how many times she had spoken to Dorian during the week after my father died. She said she did not know. I asked whether it was more than 5. She said probably. More than 10. She said perhaps. I asked whether she had told him I was staying alone at my father's house. She said yes. I asked why. She said it came up naturally. That was when I understood that the funeral call was not an isolated decision. It was one visible movement in a much larger schedule. For months, Dorian had been receiving information about our life in real time. Our disagreements, our wedding plans, my father's health, my work pressures, the nights I stayed late, the weekends Maren felt lonely. He knew the shape of our relationship because Maren had made him a participant in it. I asked whether they had slept together. She answered immediately, no. I believed her. I asked whether they had kissed. No. I believed that too. Then she said the sentence that clarified everything. She told me she had not cheated, as if the absence of physical contact settled the matter. I looked at the heater. Its metal casing expanded with a small click. I said I had not accused her of cheating. She asked what I was accusing her of. I said nothing. I was trying to understand. She became frustrated then. Not loud. Maren was rarely loud. She said she had spent years being dependable, supportive, and present. She said one terrible decision should not erase 6 years. I told her it did not erase them. She asked why I was treating her as if it did. I explained that I did not think the decision began in the chapel. It began every time Dorian's need was given access to our life without a boundary. The funeral only showed me how far that access extended. Maren said compassion was not betrayal. I agreed. Then I said, making someone else's emotional life your permanent emergency could become one. She looked away. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Outside, a branch scraped against the workshop roof. Maren asked what I wanted her to do. I could have asked her to block him, to resign from the foundation, to surrender her phone, to show me every message. Those actions might have created the appearance of repair. But my father had taught me that repair was not making something appear functional. It was finding the point where the strain began. The strain had not begun with Dorian. It had begun with the fact that Maren believed love could be measured by how urgently someone demanded her. Dorian was always in crisis. I was usually composed. He reached for her loudly. I assumed she would remain beside me, without requiring proof that I needed her. She had mistaken my steadiness for reduced need. I asked her whether she would have left the funeral if I had called during Dorian's father's burial. She stared at me. Then she said it was different. I asked why. She said because I would never make that call. I said exactly. Her face changed, not because she agreed, but because she understood what I meant. She asked whether I wanted to end our engagement. I said I did not know yet. She began crying quietly. I did not move toward her. That was unusual for me. During our 6 years together, I had crossed rooms for smaller tears. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand and said I was punishing her. I said I was trying not to promise something I could no longer see clearly. She stood and walked to the workshop door. Before leaving, she turned and said she had chosen badly in one moment, but she had still come back. I looked at my father's empty workbench. I said she came back after it was over. She left without answering. For 3 weeks, we lived mostly apart. I stayed at my father's house. Maren remained in our townhouse. We spoke about bills, wedding deposits, and practical arrangements. We did not discuss Dorian again. At work, I returned to the operations floor earlier than my manager expected. The control room occupied the 5th level of a concrete building beside the Southern Freight Yard. Along one wall, an electronic network map displayed moving train numbers in blue and amber. Each route had capacity limits. Each junction had rules. Every movement affected another. The morning I returned, a signaling failure closed Track 7 near Oakhurst Junction. 4 freight trains were already approaching from different directions. My colleague Lena asked whether we should hold all movements until the signal was repaired. I looked at the map. Holding everything would preserve the original plan for approximately 20 minutes. After that, congestion would lock the entire corridor. I instructed her to reroute 2 trains, terminate one early, and send the 4th back to Belmere Yard. She said reversing the 4th would add 6 hours to its journey. I said yes. She asked whether we might still restore the original sequence. I said not, without pretending the blockage was temporary. The words stayed with me after the corridor cleared. I had spent weeks evaluating my relationship as if the objective were to restore its original sequence. Marriage in September, shared home, children perhaps, Sundays with my father, annual trips to the coast. But my father was gone. Maren had left his funeral. Dorian's place in her emotional life was no longer something I could classify as temporary. The original sequence was unavailable. The responsible decision was not to force it. It was to work from the actual positions. On March 4th, 23 days after the funeral, I returned to Larkspur Row. Maren was home. Her car was outside, and light showed through the upstairs window. I used my key. The hallway smelled faintly of paint, because she had been testing color samples for the wedding seating board. 3 cards remained taped to the wall: bone white, warm ivory, and soft linen. My coat hook was empty. Maren came downstairs wearing gray trousers and one of my old sweaters. She stopped on the 3rd step. She asked why I had not told her I was coming. I said I needed to collect some things. She followed me into the living room. On the coffee table were 2 wine glasses. One had been used. The other was clean. My eyes moved toward it. Maren said her sister had visited the night before. I nodded. I had not asked. She said she had been waiting for me to decide whether I still wanted our life. I looked around the room. The shelves we had installed together. The framed station sketch from the day we met. The blue chair my father complained was too low. A small wooden box he had built for our wedding rings. Our life was everywhere. That made the decision harder, but not less clear. I told Maren I had spoken to the conservatory and canceled the September booking. She sat down. The cancellation had cost us 40% of the deposit. I had paid the fee from my personal account. She asked why I had done that without speaking to her. I said because we were not getting married in September. She asked whether I wanted to postpone it. I said no. The word was quiet. It still seemed to alter the pressure in the room. Maren looked toward the window. She asked whether this was because she answered a phone call. I said it was because she left my father's funeral and remained gone after knowing what she was missing. She said she thought Dorian might hurt himself. I said I understood. She asked what she was supposed to have done. I told her she could have called his brother, emergency services, a neighbor, anyone able to reach him physically. She said she had not been thinking clearly. I said I believed her. She asked whether I had any compassion for the position she was in. I said I did. Then I asked whether she had compassion for the position she left me in. Her eyes filled. She said of course she did. I told her compassion that arrived afterward could not stand beside me at the grave. Maren pressed both hands together between her knees. She said she would stop speaking to Dorian completely. I sat in the chair opposite her. I told her I did not want her to sever a relationship merely to keep me from leaving. If she believed he belonged in her life, she should make that choice honestly. If she did not, she should end it, because she understood the boundary herself. She asked why that was not enough. I said, because I no longer wanted to become the person who checked whether she was still choosing me. She told me every marriage required forgiveness. I agreed. She asked why I could not forgive her. I said forgiveness and return were not the same action. She began to cry again. This time I moved to the sofa and sat beside her. I held her hand. We remained like that for several minutes, grieving a life that still existed around us, but would no longer continue. She said she had imagined my father walking her down the aisle if her own father refused to attend. I had known about that possibility. Her father, Gideon, disapproved of the wedding because he believed Maren should reconcile with a former boyfriend from her hometown. My father had told her privately that if she needed someone beside her, he would be honored. I pictured him in the dark suit we had planned to buy. The image nearly undid me. I lowered my head and breathed until I could speak. I said he would have been proud to do it. Maren asked whether he would be proud of what I was doing now. I looked at her. She regretted the question immediately. I could see it. I did not answer for him. I said I did not know. Then I removed the engagement ring from the wooden box on the shelf and placed it on the table between us. Maren stared at it. She said I had given it to her. I said yes. She asked why I had it. I explained that she had left it in the bathroom cabinet the previous week after removing it to clean. I had found it when I collected toiletries. She looked down at her bare hand, as if noticing it for the first time. I said she could keep the ring. It had belonged to my grandmother, but it had been given honestly, and I would not take it back through resentment. She pushed the box toward me. She said she did not want it if we were over. I left it where it was. I collected 2 suitcases from the upstairs bedroom. Most of my clothes remained in the wardrobe. I took work shirts, running shoes, documents, and the dark green sweater my father gave me on my 38th birthday. Maren stood in the bedroom doorway. She asked whether I would come back for the rest. I said my aunt would arrange a day when Maren was not home. She said I could not even face her to collect my own things. I told her that was not the reason. I did not want either of us to turn boxes and furniture into reasons for another conversation. At the front door, she asked whether we could speak again after some time had passed. I said perhaps. She asked whether she should call me. I looked at the hallway wall with the 3 color cards. Bone white, warm ivory, soft linen. I said I would contact her if there was something left to say. Then I carried the suitcases to my car. She stood in the doorway as I drove away. For the next 2 months, she did not call. She sent 4 messages. The first concerned the townhouse lease. The second asked whether I wanted the station sketch. The third said Dorian had entered a private treatment program for alcohol dependence and depression. The fourth arrived on what would have been my father's 69th birthday. She wrote that she had visited his grave and left coffee on the bench. I read the message while sitting in my car outside the freight control building. For a long time, I held the phone without replying. Then I wrote that he would have appreciated the coffee, nothing more. In April, I moved from my father's house into a small apartment above a closed tailor shop on Fenrick Street. I sold the townhouse furniture I did not need. Maren kept the blue chair, the dining table, and most of the kitchenware. I kept the station sketch. My father's house remained unsold while I decided what to do with it. Every Sunday morning, I went there. I opened the workshop door, wound his watch, made coffee. Then I drove to Hallowmere Cemetery and sat on the bench between my parents' graves. I brought 2 cups at first, one for my father, one for my mother. Eventually, I stopped thinking of the ritual as evidence that I had not moved forward. Some distances are not meant to be closed. They are meant to be visited. In June, Maren called for the first time. I was at work, reviewing a revised maintenance schedule. Her name appeared on my phone at 3:08 in the afternoon. I let it ring, not as punishment. I was in a meeting. She called again at 3:11, then at 3:14. 3 calls. For a moment, I was back in the chapel, watching her screen illuminate her face. My body reacted before my thoughts did. My chest tightened. My hands became cold. Lena noticed and asked whether something was wrong. I said I needed 5 minutes. I stepped into an empty conference room and looked at the phone. There was a message from Maren. She said her mother had suffered a fall and was being taken to Bellwether Medical Center. She did not know whether it was serious. She was driving alone and frightened. I called immediately. She answered before the first full ring. Her breathing was uneven. She said her mother had fallen from a stepladder and might have injured her spine. I asked where she was. She gave me the highway marker. I asked whether she was driving safely. She said she did not know. I told her to pull into the next service station. She did. I stayed on the phone until she parked. Then I contacted her sister, who lived 15 minutes from the hospital, and arranged for her to meet Maren there. I remained on the call for 23 minutes. I did not speak about us. I did not tell her the irony was obvious. I did not make her earn my presence. When she reached the hospital, she said thank you. I said I hoped her mother would be all right. She was. A fractured wrist and 3 cracked ribs, but no spinal injury. The following evening, Maren sent a longer message. She said my call had shown her the difference between being needed and being responsible. I had helped her without making myself the only possible source of help. I had found someone who could physically reach her. I had remained until the immediate danger passed, then stepped back. She said she finally understood what I had tried to explain in the workshop. I read the message once. Then again, I did not answer that night. The next morning, I wrote that I was glad her mother was recovering. Marin asked whether I hated her. I said no. She asked whether I still loved her. I did not answer immediately. Love had not disappeared. That would have made everything easier. It remained in quiet places. In the way I still noticed buildings she would admire. In recipes I almost sent her. In the instinct to turn toward her side of the bed when waking from a bad dream. I told her part of me probably always would. She asked whether that meant there was still a way back. I looked through the control room window at the lines converging beyond the yard. 2 tracks could run parallel for miles without joining. I said no. After that, she did not contact me again. September 19 arrived warm and clear. The date remained in my mind, even though the wedding had been canceled for 6 months. At 8 o'clock that morning, my phone displayed a calendar reminder I had forgotten to delete. Marin and Owen. Wedding day. I stared at it. Then I dismissed the notification. I spent the morning at my father's house sorting tools for donation to the vocational college. I kept the socket set, the ash cabinet, and the bicycle wrench he used when I was 9. At noon, Aunt Sylvie arrived with sandwiches. She did not mention the date. Neither did I. We worked until 4:30. Before leaving, she stood in the workshop doorway and asked whether I regretted ending the engagement. I considered the question carefully. I said, I regretted that ending it had been necessary. She nodded. That distinction seemed enough for her. After she left, I found the funeral program inside the glove compartment of my car. It was Marin's copy. I must have picked it up from the chapel chair without realizing it. The paper had softened at the folds. On the back, beneath the printed order of service, Marin had written a note in blue ink. Ask Everett about walking me down the aisle. She must have written it before he died, perhaps during the meeting when we chose the readings. I sat in the driver's seat holding the program. For the first time in months, I cried without trying to stop. Not only for my father, not only for Marin, for the version of our lives in which my father stood at the conservatory entrance in a new suit, complaining that his shoes made him walk too carefully. I stayed in the car until the light faded. Then I folded the program along its original crease and placed it in the wooden box with my father's watch. Years have passed since that February morning. Marin eventually moved to another city. I heard through a mutual friend that she left the Leiden Forum and began designing community libraries. Dorian remained in recovery and later reconciled with his brother. I was glad for both of them. I did not need either life to collapse in order for my decision to remain valid. My father's house became mine. I renovated the kitchen but left the workshop almost unchanged. The outlines of his tools remain on the pegboard, though many spaces are empty now. On Sundays, I still make coffee. Sometimes I sit in the workshop instead of driving to the cemetery. Rain taps the metal roof. The watch ticks on the workbench. At 4:12, its hands no longer stop. I keep it wound. Marin never asked me directly to take her back. Perhaps she understood that asking would place another need in my hands and call it love, and I never asked her to return. Not after the chapel. Not after the grave. Not after the afternoon she finally understood. There are departures that happen when someone walks through a door. Others happen while they are still standing beside you. When their attention crosses a distance you can no longer pretend is temporary. My father's funeral program remains in the wooden box. Occasionally, when the workshop heater comes on, air moves across the workbench and lifts one corner of it. The paper opens slightly, then settles back into place.